All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are doing our in-depth, comprehensive scouting report of Atlanta Falcons second-round pass rusher Arnold Ebiketie, and we're going to be wondering whether or not he has the potential to be the next John Abraham.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And like all Locked On Sports Atlanta podcasts, you can find Locked On Falcons free and available Monday through Friday on your preferred podcast platform, whether that be Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, as well as the video version of the podcast on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So, guys, let's talk all about Arnold Ebiketie today. We've already done a scouting report on Drake London. Now we're doing a scouting report on the first of two second-round picks made by the Falcons in the 2022 NFL Draft. We'll talk about the skill set. We'll talk about the scheme fit. We'll talk about his potential. And then we'll have, player comparisons for what type of player I think Arnold Ebiketie has the potential to be. But let's talk all about his athleticism. And that's sort of the starting point for pass rushers. You need to have that baseline athleticism. And Ebiketie checks those boxes. He measured in at 6'2", 250 pounds at the combine, roughly the same size as what Takk McKinley was coming into the league. Like Takk McKinley, Arnold Ebiketie has very long arms, 34 inches, which is 72nd percentile. He has an 82-inch wingspan, which is nearly matching what Kyle Pitts has. He has a vertical jump that was in the 91st percentile at the combine. He had a broad jump that was in the 96th percentile, so very explosive in the lower body. His pro day, he ran a 4.65 40, which is 84th percentile. His short shuttle at his pro day was 85th percentile, and he ran a 3-cone of 6.95 seconds, which is 88th percentile. And if you recall back in late February when we were previewing the combine and talking about which drills matter the most, the 3-cone was the drill that was most predictive of future NFL sack production. And so those are all very good signs for Arnold Ebiketie. But hey, we know, Falcon fans know very well that just because you're a great athlete does not necessarily guarantee that you're going to be a productive NFL pass rusher. All you got to do is look over, at Jamal Anderson over there, Vic Beasley over there. So we'll see with Arnold Ebiketie, and the key for him, like I do with all my pass rushers, is how I evaluate them. I'm looking at the ways that they win, right? And there's three main ways that you can win. There's with speed, there's with power, and there's with technique. And Ebiketie, for the most part, wins with technique, right? His go-to move is a swipe move. Sometimes it's a variation of that where he's kind of chopping, but he's usually swiping down the hands, knocking down the hands of the offensive tackle, and then ripping under it to turn the corner and sack the quarterback. It's kind of similar to a variation of the cross chop that you see various teams or various pass rushers use at the NFL level. So when I went back and watched 6 of his games in 2021, I also went back and watched 1 game of his in 2020 when he was still at Temple before transferring to Penn State. But I saw in those 6 games this past year, 5 sacks, 6 hits, 5 pressures, and 16 hurries. And for me, what I distinguish between a pressure and a hurry, essentially a pressure is when the quarterback doesn't complete a pass, right? And a hurry is whenever. And so because of that, I think pressures are a little bit more valuable than hurries as I define them and how I see them. And so sacks, hits, and pressures, we could combine those into disruptions where you get a positive play for the defense. And then if you add in sacks, hits, pressures, and hurries, we can define those as just wins where the defensive end or whoever won the rep in that situation. And so when you look at Arnold Ebiketie's 16 disruptions from this past year, 56% of them came via him using some variation of that go-to swipe rip move thing that he uses. And then about 31% of them were inside counter moves, which is him using his speed to usually get the offensive tackle to overset, to overplay his outside. And then he sort of uses a swim or a juke move to go back inside and make a beeline to the quarterback to get pressure or get a sack. 6% of his disruptions were power-based moves. Those are bull rushes, those are long arms. Another 6% were unblocked. Now, when you look at the hurries added in, and you combine that to be 32 wins, 40% of those were swipe move related, 28% were inside moves, 28% were power moves, and 3% were unblocked. So where his power comes into play is usually it results in hurries rather than the true disruptions like pressers and sacks and hits and whatnot. But we'll circle back to his power in a second because I think that's an area where he can get better at. But in terms of the speed, the bend, the motor, the length, he has high-end traits for that ability, and I think he's going to reliably be able to rely on that technique and that speed to win at the next level, not so much his power. I think his power is adequate. If you go watch the Michigan game from this past year between Penn State, I think that's probably the game that best displays his power when he was able to effectively use long arms and bull rushes a number of times in that game. But I didn't see that consistently in some of the other 5 games that I saw. And I'm not sure he possesses the type of power that's going to be as effective against NFL tackles because those guys are going to be bigger, stronger, longer, more athletic, etc. And so I think one way that Ebiketie can get better in that is by bulking up. And we talked earlier this week, I think on Wednesday's episode with John Owning, and I asked him that question, and I agree with sort of what he said in that, which is if Ebiketie can sort of put on another 15 pounds, get around 260, I think that would help him add more power. I think it would also help him in run support, but more on that later. And I don't think that would be too much weight to really hurt him from being able to use his speed. As far as relying on his speed, I don't think he's necessarily going to be an elite speed rusher unless he can really sort of refine and maximize his footwork so that he can maximize the ground that he can cover within his first 3 steps in his get off. And I think he has the explosiveness to do that, but we'll just sort of see if he can refine that. But I think by and large, Ebiketie's probably going to be relying heavily on his technique, and that's going to be the best way that he can win in the NFL. When you look at guys that typically rely on speed and power, their physical traits to win, they're, heavily reliant on having favorable matchups. If if you're a speed guy and you're facing a slow-footed guy, you can win that week. But if you're not, then you're going to struggle. If you're a power guy and you're facing someone who's light in the pants, susceptible to bull rushes, that's a good week for you. But if not, then that's the case. And we've seen that before with the big Vic Beasleys and the Fowlers and the Ray Edwards that were primarily speed guys, and Takk McKinley being primarily a power guy and not really having that technical refinement. I think technical guys that tend to rely on their technique tend to be a little bit more consistent. When you're guys that are more reliant on your physical ability, like typically that doesn't translate well into the NFL unless you're an absolute freak, that you're like the 6'5", 6'6", 275, 285 guy like Julius Peppers, Ziggy Ansah. You can argue Trayvon Walker kind of fits that sort of bill. And those are the guys that can just basically, I'm a physical freak and you can't block me. And there's no tackle outside of maybe the top, 95th percentile that can handle my freakishness. And Ebiketie's not that guy. But I do think technical pass rushers tend to fare better in the NFL, and Ebiketie is that type of guy. And so technical guys can typically beat more guys than the pure speed guys or the pure power guys. And particularly when those technical guys can sort of start playing the chess match between them and the tackle. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we continue. But I think Ebiketie has the potential to be one of those guys. And we'll talk a little bit more about Ebiketie refining his technique and enhancing his technique in the years to come. But we'll also talk about his potential fit in the Dean Pease defense. And that's where we can really talk about his abilities and contributions in run support. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. You can find 3 different shows all on the same podcast feed, whether you prefer audio or video on YouTube. That's, of course, A to Z with Mark Zeno, ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste, and Hitting Hard with John Chuckery. And, of course, Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast feed also is giving you your post-game live reactions to all things Braves. So go check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on your preferred podcast feed. And guys, I also want to tell you about Bet Online, the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. You can find the latest podcasts, odds, contests, player props. Bet Online has it all. And whether you're, taking those post-game reactions or pre-game reactions and betting on the Braves, or you want to bet on the NBA playoffs now that the finals are approaching, you got the NHL playoffs, you got UFC, golf, horse racing, esports, Vegas casino games, boxing, you got the USFL, you got the NFL matchups. You can bet on the over-under for the Falcons win total. You can bet on whether or not Marcus Mariota is going to win comeback player of the year. You can find it all at betonline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. So first, let's talk about Arnold Ebiketie's fit within the Falcons sort of hybrid 3-4 scheme. And my expectation is that he'll play the jack outside linebacker role, which is what Fowler and Ade Ogundeji played last year. And that's primarily the more pass rush focused outside linebacker in this scheme. The other outside linebacker is the Sam or the strong side linebacker. My expectation is Lorenzo Carter and D'Angelo Malone will be playing those roles, and that job is a little bit more of a coverage role than necessarily they tend to drop in coverage a little bit more than necessarily the jack linebacker. The jack linebacker will drop in coverage occasionally. It's a spot drop, and what that means is typically he's going to cover the flat in some sort of zone when DMPs is trying to bring pressure from somewhere else, and he'll drop that guy. And I think Ebiketie is capable of doing that. He did that, a decent amount at Penn State and didn't seem to be an issue. So in terms of the coverage abilities, I think Ebiketie can handle those spot dropping, but not necessarily a guy that you think is going to be able to line up with tight ends and cover those guys down the field, because he wasn't particularly good at that. The few opportunities he got to do that. Now, when it comes to playing the run, I think Ebiketie does a decent job when it comes to setting the edge, is what you primarily want those outside linebackers to be. I think with added strength, he could be better at that. But I do think you see, flashes of what strength he does have. It tended to be a lot more effective against tight ends when he was out on the edge, when he was in college, and it tended to overwhelm those guys, but tended to get a little bit pushed around a little bit more when he was facing tackles. And so again, that's where I think adding a little bit of mass could improve his game in terms of holding that point of attack against NFL caliber tackles. And typically the way that Dean Pease wants, those guys up front to play the run, he wants them to control their gap. And Ebiketie has the length, has the ability to do that there. Again, added bass could help him do a better job there. But when you look at Ebiketie, most of his good run defensive plays, it's usually at Penn State, it was him being disruptive. It was him penetrating into the backfield. He was really good at backdooring gaps where you would have offensive linemen try to make reach blocks on sort of outside zone runs, and he would kind of just backdoor through the gap, shoot the gap, and make the play in the backfield. And he never did that sort of like in a freelance way. It was always under the auspices of the player behind him, usually a linebacker or a nickel corner or somebody would cover that outside gap instead of him. I didn't see too many instances where he was making positive plays against the run by just simply holding the point of attack, disengaging, wrapping out the ball carrier at that point in time. Like Dean Pease typically refers, Penn State usually played a little bit more of that disruptive style, similar to what we saw here in Atlanta under Dan Quinn and Raheem Morris, where he wanted guys to get upfield and, basically play the run on the way to the quarterback type of mentality. But Penn State played that way. And the thing that stood out to me is that it seemed like Ebiketie was well coached and was disciplined, because the way that Penn State seemed to want to play things, particularly this was apparent to me when they would play quarterbacks that they would run read options and whatnot. His assignment was always to take the quarterback in those instances. And you never saw instances where he was cheating, he was biting, he was freelancing or anything and like peeking at what the running back was doing. No, he was always like, my guy's the quarterback, I'm going to take the quarterback. And I think that really stresses what Ebiketie brings to the table, which gets back to what Dean Pease really does want in his defensive players, is guys that do their job. And I think Ebiketie did that pretty consistently at Penn State. So that's a good sign. So even if he's not the best run defender, I do expect him to be able to do his job. And defending the run is all well and good, but ultimately rushing the quarterback is going to be what pays the bills, and that's going to be heavily dependent on how good Ebiketie is, depending on improving his technique. And again, I think that go-to move that he uses, that swipe move, will certainly translate well to the next level. But I think he'll be even better if he can add more moves. Again, mentioning the cross chop earlier, I think that would be a natural sort of fit in his repertoire of moves. We already have seen these sort of inside swim. I don't know if that's going to be as effective at the NFL level, just because NFL tackles are a little bit better at protecting their inside shoulder, as well as they tend to, if that's a real issue, then the left guard is going to help out a little bit more and chip that way. And really, when it comes to refining Ebiketie's technique, it's not just simply, oh, you just add a whole bunch of different moves and he'll throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. It's really about playing that chess match. And, the offensive tackle does X, he counters with Y, then the offensive tackle counters with Z, and then Ebiketie throws Q at him, or whatever the case may be. And I think Ebiketie flashed that type of ability to play that chess match. And we had on John Oning early on the podcast earlier this week, and he said, and used one instance that illustrated one instance that came late in that game against Michigan, where Ebiketie used that long arm to get into the chest of the left tackle, and then he was able to get pressure on the quarterback on that particular play. And then, the very next snap, the offensive tackle was like, okay, I can't let him get in my chest, so I'm gonna have to initiate contact and throw my punch on my setup. And Ebiketie sort of saw that coming. When the offensive tackle threw his hands, he swiped them down, beat him around the corner, got an easy sack strip on that play. And that sort of sequence, not only illustrates Ebiketie playing that chess match of like, I did this thing, you countered with this, and I countered with this, as well as also indicating that this is where, improving his power, adding that element, that sequence kind of shows you that that can be valuable, where if he can use his power more, that can lead to more instances where, like we showed in the Michigan game, where guys try to counter and he can counter it again. I think what you want to see from the top pass rushers is that they typically set things up, pretty consistently. And, when I look at the top pass rushers, particularly the most technical pass rushers in the league, one of the common things that you see is that you'll see their like first three steps being nearly identical, so that they come off the ball the exact same way. And they have a number of moves that they build off of that initial sequence based off of what the offensive tackle is doing in that first few seconds after the snap. And that's what, Carl Lawson is a great example of that. And that's why I was a big fan of Carl Lawson a year ago and was, dreaming of the Falcons signing him. When you look at the guys like Nick and Joey Bosa, they do that really well in terms of, making their first few steps identical and, keeping the offensive tackle guessing on what's going to come. And Ebiketie doesn't really show that quite yet, but if he can develop that, if he can refine that, that's the type of potential that he could have and be one of the better pass rushers in the league. And there's no reason to think that he won't work on that part and hone that craft in his game. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you he's going to be one of the top 5 pass rushers in the league in 3 to 5 years, but I certainly think he has the potential to be one of the top 15 to 20 pass rushers in the league. And the Falcons haven't had that type of pass rusher on their team since the heyday of John Abraham. And we've spent basically a decade looking for the guy to replace John Abraham. And for me personally, when we signed Osi Umenyiora, I didn't think he was going to be that guy. When we drafted Vic Beasley and Takk McKinley, I didn't think they were going to be that. I think Dante Fowler was going to be that guy. And finally, I'm sitting here going like, I think maybe Arnold Ebiketie might be that guy that can fill the John Abraham shoes. And we'll just sort of see what he lives up to in terms of his potential. But I certainly see, I'm fairly confident that he can be like an 8 sack guy, but I think he has the potential to be, a double-digit sack guy, a guy that can get you 10 to 12 sacks, 60, 70, 80 pressures a year at his peak. And that's what John Abraham was for this Falcons team many years ago. And that's a perfect segue to change the conversation to talking about Arnold Ebiketie's floor, his ceiling, and using some NFL comparisons. And, if you listen to the episode with John Owning earlier this week, you might be able to guess. I kind of spoiled one of my comps coming up, but whether he's the floor, ceiling, or eye level, we'll just sort of have to see. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But before we get there, I want to tell you all about Built Bar, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, even better than a candy bar, because Built Bars not only taste great, they're good for you. They're low in sugar, calories, and carbs, high in protein, high in fiber. I've been spouting off about the birthday cake puff, but they have a new flavor in the brownie batter puff. And who didn't love licking the bowl when your mom made brownies when you were a kid? And you did that as a kid, and now if you're an adult, it's kind of frowned upon. But Built Bars brownie batter puff, leaves you all smiles because it tastes good and it's good for you. You won't feel guilty about licking the bowl ever again by heading on over and buying yourself a box of brownie batter puff at built.com. When you do use the promo code LOCKED15, you'll get 15% off your order. That's LOCKED15, LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So when we talk about player comps and floors, eye levels, and ceilings, let's, give you a refresher on how I typically do this. The floor to me is kind of the player's starting point, where I think he's going to be year one coming into his NFL career. His ceiling, obviously, is what I think his max potential is going to be. And then his eye level is like halfway in between, where I think is probably going to be the most realistic projection for what the player should be. And it was kind of hard to come up with comps for Arnold Ebiketie, just because most guys his size at 6'2", 250 tend to be like purely speed guys. You don't see that many sort of technical guys at that size. And you also don't see too many guys with his same length. Most of the guys that have his type of wingspan typically are like 6'5" or taller, or whatever the case may be. So I like to try to get guys that are athletically and play profile very similar when it comes to this stuff. And so it was hard coming up with guys that sort of fit that. And so I had to kind of look around the internet to see what other people were sort of comping, him to get a better idea of where I wanted to go with some of these things. And I looked at Bleacher Report. We had Derek Klassen on earlier, and he comped him to Harold Landry. Pro Football Focus and their draft guide comped him to Charles Harris, the former Falcon legend. The Ringers, Danny Kelly, had him comp to Yannick Ngakoue. And I think all those comparisons make sense. I see all the sort of overlap in what Ebiketie does versus what some of those guys do. And so with my floor comparison, I was leaning towards Charles Harris just because he's probably at the lower level of these guys. But I didn't like that comp, mainly because Harris sort of got off to a slow start, and you could have labeled him a bust after his first 3 years in Miami, and then obviously didn't do a whole lot in Atlanta, and then kind of broke out this past year with the Lions. So instead, my floor for Arnold Ebiketie is Dante Fowler. So another former Falcon player that didn't quite work out. But when I look at these three guys, whether it's Ebiketie, whether it's Fowler, whether it's Harris, they all have similar frames. They all have 80-inch wingspans. Fowler and Harris are certainly more reliant on their speed than Ebiketie, I think, is going to be. But I will be, on that note, curious if, when Ebiketie transitions to the NFL, if he is more of a speed guy out the gate, because his technique is not refined enough to really be that effective against NFL tackles. I noticed other technicians in the past, Brian Burns as one example, that were relatively well refined and technical in college when he was at FSU, but then like in his first year in the NFL at Carolina, like almost all his production came purely off of winning with speed. And so I wonder if Ebiketie will sort of fall into that sort of trap again. But getting back into Fowler and the comparisons there, you saw pretty steady production from Dante Fowler his first 3 years in the league when he was with Jacksonville, averaging 5 sacks, 35 pressures each year. Then he had that breakout campaign once he was traded to the Rams in year 4 and had the sort of Aaron Donald effect, as we call it. Then he, of course, came to Atlanta, and we saw his production regress closer to what it was in Jacksonville levels. In fact, it was a little bit below those Jacksonville levels. And what we kind of conclude now that, Fowler has been in the league for 6-7 years, is a guy that's probably ideally suited to be more of the fourth guy in a pass rush rotation, or at least in a good pass rush rotation. Unfortunately, Arnold Ebiketie is not going to an environment similar to what Fowler had at the beginning of his career in those Saxonville days. Ebiketie is going to more likely be the second or third guy here in Atlanta. and competently, I think, give you 4 to 6 sacks right out the gates, 30, 40 pressures right out the gates. I think that's a good benchmark for Arnold Ebiketie to reach, in a realistic benchmark for him to reach in year one. And I think him in conjunction with Grady Jarrett and Lorenzo Carter give the Falcons a solid trio, comparable to what we saw in 2020 or what we hoped we saw in 2020. Unfortunately, injuries kind of hijacked that with Tack McKinley and Dante Fowler alongside Grady Jarrett. And then hopefully you can see Arnold Ebiketie build off of that in years 2 and beyond. But I think even without sort of significant improvement, Ebiketie should be comfortable being sort of that fourth wheel, similar to what Fowler was in Jacksonville when he was playing behind Calais Campbell and Malik Jackson and Yannick Ngakoue. And speaking of Ngakoue, I was very tempted to use Ngakoue and to borrow from the Ringer and use Ngakoue as my ceiling comp for Arnold Ebiketie, because he's also the cross chop king. And again, as I said earlier, hoping that Ebiketie can add that to his arsenal, but ultimately, as you probably guessed from the earlier appearance with John Owning, my ceiling comp for Arnold Ebiketie is DeMarcus Lawrence with the Dallas Cowboys. And, they're similar stature. Lawrence is 6'3", 251, at least at the combine was, with an 81-inch wingspan. They both are guys that primarily win with speed, technique, and bend versus winning with power. Both guys are high motor guys. And I imagine, sort of peak DeMarcus Lawrence could be what Arnold Ebiketie's final form could be. And when you look back at Lawrence's career in Dallas, he wasn't necessarily off to the best start in his career, in part due to injuries. Then in years 4 and 5, we saw him peak, and he combined for 25 sacks and 142 pressures in those 2 years. And that goes back to what we said earlier, where Ebiketie has that potential to be maybe a 12-sack guy, maybe a guy that can get you 70, 80 pressures a year. We've seen Lawrence's production decline a little bit in the last couple of years. Part of that is due to injuries sort of rearing their ugly head again. But I think Lawrence is still one of the better pass rushers in the NFL. When you look at his entire 8-year career in the NFL, he's averaged 7.5 sacks per 16 games that he's played in. And you know who also averaged, roughly 7.5 sacks per 16 games, or actually it was 7.7 sacks per 16? That was Patrick Kearney, the last in-house developmental success story for the Falcons in terms of their pass rush. We also saw Kearney, like Lawrence, hit double-digit sack seasons at their peaks in the primes of their career. And I'll be curious when it comes to someone like Ebiketie, whether 3 to 5 years where we're expecting him to start the peak and reach that level of what Lawrence and Kearney were in that years, whether or not he can hit those double-digit sacks and then kind of sustain it long term, which we didn't necessarily see Lawrence and Kearney do. But I think that gets into the conversation a little bit of like why people like myself think sack production is a little overrated when you particularly compare it to pressures, just because pressures tend to be a little bit more stable and sustainable year to year, and there's a lot more variance in sacks. You'll have a guy that has 10 sacks one year, then 12 sacks, and 6, then 9, nice, 11.5 the next year, and then 7.5. And Kearney and Lawrence were good examples of that. But I think Lawrence is still one of the top 15 to 20 pass rushers in the NFL. I still think he's capable of being a number one guy for a team's pass rush, especially when he's healthy. And I think Ebiketie has that same potential to be a sort of elite dog. Now that gets us to sort of the more realistic projection with his eye level. And again, I'm going to borrow from the earlier comp and use Harold Landry from Bleacher Report. And of course, Harold Landry's coming off a really productive year where he had 12 sacks this past year, 64 pressures. This was his 4th NFL season, contract year, earned the contract, got paid. And I'll be curious to sort of see where Landry goes from here. And it's kind of a similar trajectory as Dante Fowler a little bit. Landry is mostly a very solid pass rusher, has been that throughout his career, wins mostly with speed and bend. Occasionally you'll see some good techniques, some swipe moves, etc. But Landry's not a lead dog despite his 2021 production seemingly indicating that. And maybe he's a little bit closer to Fowler and being more of a third guy in a 4-man rush or whatever the case may be. Because when you look at Landry's first 3 years prior to this breakout year, he was averaging about 6 sacks, 46 pressures, prior to this season. And when you look at his per snap pressure rate in terms of opportunities and whatnot, it's not that much better than what Fowler's pressure rate was when he was in Jacksonville. And what's interesting about Landry is if you look at Brandon Thorne, who in his Trench Warfare Substack does true sack rate, which is trying to look qualitatively at sack production, and he has this high versus low quality sacks, and high quality are ones where you're basically beating a guy with a move, and low quality are instances where you're unblocked or winning with scheme, with stunts and twists and whatnot. And Landry this past year in his breakout year had a bunch of those low quality sacks to kind of pad his total. He had a couple of high quality ones as well, but because of that, my expectation is that Landry will kind of regress to the mean a little bit and look a little bit more like earlier career Harold Landry than he did a year ago. But I do wonder if he's going to be able to sustain a little bit and maybe plateau a little bit. We saw with Fowler, he was sort of up, peaked, and then kind of declined. And I wonder with Landry, is he going to peak and then kind of plateau a little bit, you know? So we'll just sort of have to keep an eye on that and see sort of, if in 2 or 3 years comping, or basically I'm wondering if we're going to look at Harold Landry the same way that we look at Dante Fowler and be like, oh yeah, he was kind of good, but he was not that good. And so there may not be that much of a difference between me projecting Ebiketie's floor to be Fowler and, Landry to be his eye level. That's not that may not be a halfway spot between him and DeMarcus Lawrence. That may be like, a step up, that's knee level or whatever the case may be. So we'll see. But right now I'm making a fairly big assumption is what the point I'm trying to get at, which is like Landry's going to plateau and be like a 6 to 8 sack guy and maybe get you like 50 plus pressures per year. And I kind of think that's kind of the eye level for a guy like Arnold Ebiketie. And I think you combine that type of player with a Grady Jarrett is giving you more than what Dante Fowler did. A guy that can give you that outside speed rush, and you combine that with Grady Jarrett's ability to disrupt up the middle, and that's a good combination. I think Ebiketie can be that guy, given that he's going to win primarily to the outside with that swipe move and with his speed and all those various things. So in conclusion, when we look at Arnold Ebiketie's comps, his floor is Dante Fowler, and we're looking at a player that's probably getting like 4 sacks, 35 pressures each and every year. His eye level is Harold Landry, 6 sacks, 50 pressures. His ceiling is DeMarcus Lawrence, which is 8 sacks, 70 pressures. And it's funny when you break it down like that, that basically the difference between a guy getting 2 more sacks and maybe 1 more pressure per game, it completely changes kind of how how those guys are perceived. And that's kind of the difference between the subtle differences between different tiers of pass rusher. Now, when it comes to Arnold Ebiketie possibly giving you more than that and being that perennial double digit sack guy, I think he has the potential to be that, but I tend to reserve those projections. I tend to be a little bit more conservative with my projections in that in general, but I also tend to not want to put those projections on everybody because I tend to reserve those for sort of the elite pass rushing prospects. And I don't think Arnold Ebiketie is that type of guy. Those are the guys that I'm putting on Khalil Mack. Like, for example, Khalil Mack in his 8 years in the NFL has averaged 10.5 sacks and 72 pressures every 16 games. John Abraham, for example, averaged 10.7 sacks and 62 pressures every 16 games. And so I'm not going to quite put those types of expectations on Arnold Ebiketie. Generally, I'm going to reserve those for the guys that I think coming out of college, those 3 main boxes that we're talking about, checking speed, power, and technique, that, check those boxes with maybe with a little bit more of a pink highlighter or whatever the case may be. So in the end, I am certainly excited about Arnold Ebiketie's potential. I'm looking forward to what he's going to be in a few years with refinement. I'm expecting them to go through some adjustments in year 1, some a bit of culture shock, but I do expect we'll see plenty of flashes of that type of potential. But I'm not going to go necessarily crazy with my year 1 projection because I'm looking at the schedule and I'm seeing a whole lot of quality offensive tackles that he's facing almost every single week. Although there will be a number of sort of rookies that he's going to face, potentially some young, unproven guys. We know injuries matter, and we'll see how that plays out. So he'll have his opportunities to showcase his skills against some lesser guys or some unproven guys this year as well, in addition to matching with some of the top tackles in the league that may do a little bit better job stymieing him out of the gates as he adjusts to the NFL. So we'll see. Now, the last thing I'll say about Arnold Ebiketie that doesn't necessarily fit previously is one of the things I did notice on film was he wasn't great when it came to Penn State using stunts all that much. And, that may not be a big deal because we didn't see that much from Dean Pease last year, particularly when you compare him to how often like Raheem Morris loved to use stunts as a way of enhancing the pass rush. And probably when we get later in the summer, when we start talking a little bit more in depth about ways where the Falcons can improve their pass rush, adding more stunts and twists to the mix make a lot more sense. And it goes back kind of to the Harold Landry comparison, where a lot of his production came in that regard based off of Brandon Thorne's film study. And I wonder a little bit if Arnold Ebiketie fits into that sort of mold in this regard. And that's meaningful to me because, like, when I look at guys like Lorenzo Carter, I know a lot of his production in New York came off that. We know Grady Jarrett was very effective in that, playing under that style with Raheem Morris and Dan Quinn. And I'll be curious to sort of see if Dean P's, aversion to running that changes in the future, or if Ebiketie works better in that. So we'll just sort of have to see how that plays out. But it's just something to keep an eye on. Just wanted to plant that seed for future consideration. So, guys, that's going to do it for us here on the Arnold Ebiketie Scouting Report. I welcome your feedback. And I know sometimes on this podcast I spend too much time complaining about comments and some of the feedback, but we're still relatively new to YouTube, about 7 months now, still trying to cultivate, this sort of audience. And so when I get, comments that are like, oh, you're a hater and you're negative and I hate you and I hate the show, I'm like, okay, like that's cool, but I can't do anything. And recently with the Drake London Scouting Report, I had a decent back and forth. I love talking football. And I had a decent back and forth with this guy who was like kind of, saying like he saw a lot of Larry Fitzgerald and Drake London, and me being a Pitt alum and being passionate. Larry, the legend defender. And, I used to hook up with a girl that used to tutor him. So I like to take credit for Larry Fitzgerald getting through school and becoming the great NFL player that he is by proxy. But like, we had a nice engaging conversation. And even though we didn't really agree on certain things, like I love having those conversations. So if you want to have those conversations about Arnold Ebiketie, whether you think I'm too high on him, too low on him, you want to talk about pass rushers, you want to hate on Vic Beasley a little bit, whatever you want to do, I'm more than welcome to doing that in chat, in the comments, or whatever the case may be. If you want to hit me up via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can hit me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons as well. So we'll figure out this whole comment thing and this whole feedback thing in the future, but hopefully I'll hear from you guys on Arnold Ebiketie. That will do it for us this week on Locked On Falcons. Next week at some point we'll do the Troy Anderson Scouting Report. My goal is to try to get it midweek. We'll start trying to transition more to quarterback stuff with Desmond Ridder, and we'll have another guest on to talk a little bit more in depth about Desmond Ridder and his potential in the NFL. And I don't know if I'm going to get to a Desmond Ridder Scouting Report by the end of the week, but my goal is right now, I don't want to do it later than next Sunday night on YouTube, next Monday morning on audio. So that's the kind of the plan. Hopefully we can, have a relatively quick turnaround on some of these, day 3 guys, as we get into the first weeks of June, but a lot of great content coming for you guys. Probably won't go as deep on Troy Anderson, but I'm sure we have plenty to say about the linebacker position group in the coming days and week, depending on what happens with Deion Jones. So we'll see how that all plays out. We'll still probably have a little bit more conversation about Arnold Ebiketie a little bit later, trying to line up some guests there to get their insights in that. So, just because we've done the scouting report doesn't mean the conversation on these players is over, but just we try to focus on maybe the next guy on the list. So that will do it for us, guys. I hope you have a great weekend. Appreciate it. Till then.